On the 4th of May 1535, the monk John Houghton left his prison cell in the Tower for the last time. Over the next few hours he would suffer the worst kind of execution the English legal system has to offer, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It starts with being drawn to your place of execution. You are tied hand and feet to a sled and taken there behind a horse or an ox. For John Houghton, from his prison in the Tower to the execution site at Tyburn, this was a journey of 4 miles. Once you get there, you'll meet your executioner, who will kneel and ask your forgiveness. John Houghton gave it. His colleague, Maurice Chauncy, said, "How kindly he spoke to his executioner, how generously and lovingly he embraced and kissed him, how freely and willingly and humbly he forgave him, how piously and fervently he prayed for him and all who stood by." Then you stand up on a cart and they put the noose around your neck. There is no trapdoor. Instead, they simply pull the cart away from under you, so you suffocate slowly. But just before you actually asphyxiate, they'll cut the rope. Then they cut your bits off, they cut your stomach open, and they pull out your insides. Now you think this would kill you, but occasionally you will stay alive just long enough to watch your insides being burned in a fire. John Houghton is heard praying aloud throughout, right up until the moment they pulled out his heart. Beheaded, and the body is cut into 4. Your head is put on a spike at London Bridge, and the 4 parts of your body are sent to 4 towns around the country where you have friends to remind them not to mess with the king again. John Houghton's arm is nailed to the door of his own monastery. We often think of this as a medieval punishment, and it does originate in the 13th century. But hanging, drawing and quartering carries on in some form well into the 18th century and isn't officially abolished until 1870.
Oh, and people went to these for fun? They treated them as entertainment?
By the 19th century, so many writers have compared public executions to forms of entertainment that it's a tired cliché. One rector, called S.G. Osborne, says that the crowd goes to an execution as to a play and treat it as a sort of gala day. A police inspector called Thomas Kittle said that the crowd behaved as if they were at a prize fight or witnessing a theatrical scene. A sheriff of the City of London called Hilary Nissen said that executions were regarded as a matter of entertainment by the public. The king of doing this is Charles Dickens, who goes to see the double hanging of husband and wife team Frederick and Marie Manning in 1849 and writes, "The horrors of the gibbet and of the crime which brought the wretched murderers to it faded, in my mind, before the atrocious bearing, looks and language of the assembled spectators. Fightings, faintings, whistlings, imitations of punch, brutal jokes, tumultuous demonstrations of indecent delight when swooning women were dragged out of the crowd by the police with their dresses disordered, gave a new zest to the general entertainment." London's history is full of men going to a hanging, watching the cart pull away and the feet kick, and looking around them and going, "Wow, everyone here is barbaric except for me." But Maurice Chauncy isn't describing John Houghton's execution because he thinks it's entertaining. He loves Houghton. A not insignificant portion of his description focuses on how brutal the execution is. Sufferings grievous to hear of, fearful to think of, and how much more fearful to endure. He's not the only one. People go to see the executions of those they support just as much as those they hate. When John Tiptoft was executed in 1470, the crowd was so much on his side that they covered his gallows with carpets and tapestries to express their support, and so that he could die in comfort and luxury. According to Thomas Herbert, the people at the execution of Charles I were silent, with dejected faces. So if it isn't for entertainment, at least not always, what reason could one possibly have for going to see a public execution?
It's not a coincidence that the worst punishments aren't necessarily given to the most violent criminals, but to those whose crimes pose the biggest threat to the social order. Hangings, drawings and quarterings are reserved not for serial killers or child molesters or even war criminals, but to men who commit treason, disobedience against the monarch. In the case of John Houghton, that might not be because you were or were planning to do something violent. John Houghton's crime was simply refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII as the head of the church. Counterfeiting money counts as treason for a huge portion of London's history, not because it's a particularly violent crime, but because it threatens the national economy. Piracy is another crime that's considered particularly bad, not because of its violence against individual people, but because it threatens the economy of the whole country. And therefore, the execution of pirates is given an extra twist. After being hanged, the body is left on the gibbet until the tide has washed over it 3 times. Pirates' bodies are sometimes tarred and placed in cages all the way down the Thames to remind other sailors not to turn pirate. These elaborate punishments aren't retribution then. They're not an eye for an eye. John Houghton never killed anyone, and he definitely never disemboweled anyone and burned their innards. These executions are to impress upon you, in the starkest possible terms, not to follow him. The philosopher Bernard Mandeville said, "It is not the death of those poor souls that is chiefly aimed at in executions, but the terror we would have it strike in others of the same loose principles." Lord Somerville really drops the pretence when he defends public executions on the grounds that, in what, speaking generally, one may call all history, it has been usual to execute great criminals before the public with, as far as one can judge, the general idea prevailing in all governments that such a spectacle excited a wholesome terror in the mass of the people. So sure, they want you to get the message, but surely there's an easier, less lurid way of doing it? Well, when John Houghton is executed, newspapers don't exist yet. News travels by word of mouth and town criers and official announcements. You can't follow Henry VIII on Instagram or read Thomas Cromwell's column in the Daily Mail or tune into the BBC for an emergency dispatch from Flodden Field. Instead, the authorities have to make something that you will turn up for and see for yourself. Something so big and so dramatic that you cannot go about your day as usual while it's happening. This doesn't just hold for executions, but for lots of historical punishments. Public penance, the pillory, the stocks, the scold's bridle, being whipped through the streets. If something like this is happening at the end of your road, you're gonna go down there and see what all the fuss is about. The authorities are creating a spectacle on purpose. The point is not just to cause the victim a great deal of pain. They could do that in private. The authorities want to use executions to send a message. Don't do what that guy did. And if they make something that no one turns up to, they've failed. According to his biographer, James Boswell, the writer Samuel Johnson once said, "Sir, executions are intended to draw spectators. If they do not draw spectators, they don't answer their purpose." It's considered part of your duty as a good citizen to take that message on board. Schools sometimes took their students on field trips to see public executions in order to make sure they learned this lesson young. This is absolutely not meant to be a fun day out for the kids. It is meant to shock you into towing the line. Some parents even beat their children on the day of an execution to try and make this lesson stick. So, attending public executions helps you be a good citizen. But it also helps you stay on top of current events. On 9/11, people all over the world tuned in to watch a second plane hit the World Trade Center. As news cameras focused on the upper story windows, I remember asking my parents why people were jumping. Blurry, grainy images of falling bodies dominated the news cycle for months. To those of you who are old enough to remember 9/11, did you keep the TV on? Once you realised what was happening, did you stay tuned in? I know there were some schools in the US where teachers turned it on for the kids during the school day. You didn't do that for entertainment though, did you? If you're one of those people whose social media algorithm has been showing you nothing but footage from inside the Gaza Strip for the past year, you've not been watching those for fun, right? There are other reasons we're watching this stuff. To be informed, to know what's happening, to understand, to see something firsthand. If tomorrow the government announced that they were going to hang some notorious paedophile from Belmarsh in the middle of Trafalgar Square, do you not think every news camera in the country would be there? But also, executions don't mean to us what they meant to medieval or early modern Londoners. You are not obliterating a person. You are sending them to the hereafter.
The most important thing to happen in Christianity is an execution. In early medieval Christianity, the most popular depiction of Christ was Christ in majesty, sitting resplendent as a king in heaven. But by the 14th century, the most popular image has become the crucifixion, a brutal, public execution. That's what's above the altar in your church. That's how Christ is most often depicted. I do wonder if it's a coincidence that change happens at the same time that hanging, drawing and quartering becomes an official part of the legal system in the 1351 Treason Act. You would be really used to thinking about and seeing physical torture because you see Christ on the cross all the time, and you tell stories about the torture of saints and martyrs. An execution isn't so much about punishing the individual, but about purifying their soul through suffering. The body and the soul are one, and inflicting pain on the body can purge sins from the soul. The idea that God has infinite mercy is deadly serious. Even traitors can go to heaven. But to get it, you have to go through pain in order to make amends and restore balance. And the worse your crime, the more pain you have to go through. This is how it works in the afterlife with purgatory, and it's how it works on earth with the legal system, penance, and self-flagellation. Remember, this is a period when self-flagellation is still a massive thing. I'm not going to say everyone's doing this, but 1200 to 1500 is the height of its popularity as a practice. If you're wearing a hair shirt under your clothes for little sins, like thinking about Mrs. Partridge instead of listening to your church service, then imagine what pain you have to go through to get something like treason off your soul. The reduction of pain just isn't considered very important in medieval society. Thomas Aquinas thought that guilt, or what he called inward pain, was so bad that people would seek out outward pain in order to avoid it, and that as long as it wasn't also causing you guilt, outward pain was even a source of inward joy. The mystic, Julian of Norwich, writes that she wants every kind of pain, bodily and spiritual, so that she would become closer to Christ, and that pain purges and makes us know ourselves and ask for mercy. Man, Christianity is the real blood for the blood god. I think it's really easy for us to forget how deeply religious everyone was in medieval and early modern history. But if you read sources from the period, they go on and on about it. It's all they want to talk about. The word atheist doesn't even exist until like 40 years after John Houghton dies. And even then, it just means the wrong flavour of Christian for ages. And so if you're ever reading anything about these periods, whether it's a history textbook or the new historical romance that doesn't include people talking about religion all the time, they're probably missing something. This also explains why people in the past faced these horrific executions so stoically, why they didn't try and fight back, why they meekly laid their heads on the block over and over again. When diarist Samuel Pepys goes to see Major General Thomas Harrison hanged, drawn and quartered in 1660, he says he looked as cheerful as any man could do in that condition. When writer Thomas More sees John Houghton and his colleagues being taken to their execution, he turns to a friend of his and says, "These blessed fathers be now as cheerfully going to their deaths as bridegrooms to their marriage." And again, they get this from Christ's example. It's really clearly communicated in the Bible. Jesus doesn't fight the Roman authorities or run away when he knows they're coming for him. He bears his punishment calmly, even though it really, really hurts the whole time he's dying. So of course it's natural to think, well, that's what I'm going to do too. Making a good death was so important. You could even get a book called Ars Moriendi that instructed you on how to do it. You confess your sins, pray for forgiveness, accept your punishment, and face your death stoically. If you're innocent, then you will join the martyrs and the saints and go straight to heaven. If you're guilty, then this is the only way you'll get a chance from purging the sins from your soul at all. If you don't do these things, then it's a sign that you really are damned and that God has given up on you. Aquinas writes that both divine and human laws command such like sinners to be put to death, because there is greater likelihood of their harming others than of their mending their ways. Nevertheless, the judge puts this into effect not out of hatred for the sinners, but out of the love of charity, by reason of which he prefers the public good to the life of the individual. Moreover, the death inflicted by the judge profits the sinner, if he be converted, unto the expiation of his crime, and if he be not converted, it profits so as to put an end to the sin, because the sinner is thus deprived of the power to sin any more. This is also why people like John Houghton sometimes publicly forgave their executioners. When Richard Le Scrope was executed in 1405, he told his executioner that he should strike off his head, "For his love that suffered wounds for all mankind, you strike me, and I forgive you my death." Some people also reconciled with the crowd that came to see them. They promised to try and ask them to get into heaven earlier once they got there, and they also asked the crowd to pray for them so that they would get into heaven earlier too. So I've been pretty down on Christianity in this section. I think after all this, it'd be easy for people living in a more secular time to say, oh, so religion brainwashed them and made them stupid. And I'd just like to ask you to put that reaction to one side for a minute. We're going to put it in a box over here. It's okay, you can pick it up again at the end of the video, but for now, we're just going to tuck it away. One of the hardest things in history is properly empathising with people who have very different worldviews from you. But when you can manage it, that's the real work of history. So, I would like you to remember that unless you have always been right about everything, then you are not completely rational either. You have contradictory ideas in your head, And you do things that maybe in 500 years' time people are going to look back on in disgust. It's happened to every other human in history so far, and I promise you aren't any different. If everyone had to create an entire moral framework for themselves from first principles without regard to what the rest of society thinks, it'd be a huge waste of brain power and time. So, if public executions serve all these functions in society, why did they stop? What changes?
If the point of public executions is to teach your citizens a lesson about how to behave, then perhaps part of the reason that they were abolished is that they were no longer serving this purpose. That crowds were not watching in horrified, meek silence, but were telling their own stories about what an execution means. People would leave their factory and workshop jobs to go and see an execution during the day, and they'd end up in pubs and coffee shops in the evenings, where political dissent was fermented. They wrote newspapers and pamphlets and organised demonstrations for the working class to get the vote, for an end to monarchy, for greater religious freedom, and for private land to be made public. So by that logic, people not behaving properly at executions is what ended them. Perhaps what people mean when they write that it is notorious that the crowds who attend them go with the same ease and indifference they would to a race, is that the crowd are supposed to be learning a moral lesson about how to behave, and it clearly isn't working. By the 18th century, people start to think that watching violent events like executions, and also things like cockfights and whippings, actually make you more violent. In 1773, John Scott says that public scenes of violence degrade man to the brute, and only serve to obliterate the sense of shame, to awaken the diabolical passions of wrath and revenge in the punished, and extinguish all compassion in the bosom of the punisher. William Makepeace Thackeray also argues that public executions are an ineffective deterrent, saying that you deter no one else from committing the crime by killing. You give us, to be sure, half an hour's pleasant entertainment. These days, we're so used to being told that our voices matter and our opinion matters. But for most of London's history, it literally doesn't. Hardly any of these people can vote. You're not supporting public executions by going to see them. They're not doing more or fewer based on how popular they are. You're not buying a ticket from them that funds further executions, so you might as well go. But as society becomes more democratic, as more people start getting the vote, as your opinion starts to matter more, you might start to feel embarrassed about attending an execution, or even that it's sinful. Even defenders of the death penalty, like Richard Tanner, said that he didn't go to them himself because he was worried that people would think he was there for fun. Henry Rich said that it was common to feel ashamed of going to an execution, especially if you were middle class. Who, indeed, are the persons of any pretensions whatever to respectability, who, being convicted of having witnessed one of these exhibitions, do not forthwith feel it necessary to make some excuses for having done so? In his 1836 essay, Civilization, John Stuart Mill argues that as society becomes less barbaric and more civilised, it starts not alleviating painful experiences, but hiding them behind closed doors, especially hiding them from those who are doing well in society. One of the effects of civilization is that the spectacle, and even the very idea of pain, is kept more and more out of the sight of those classes who enjoy in their fullness the very benefits of civilization. Public executions are abolished in the UK in 1868. After that, they took place behind closed doors inside prisons for another 100 years. This would have been horrifying to the crowd that saw John Houghton executed in the 1530s. If the king is executing people in secret, what else is he doing that you don't know about? Even in the 19th century, people who want the death penalty completely abolished argue that if it happens behind closed doors, the public will forget about it and the institution will carry on for longer. Whereas if they have to look at it every time, they won't put up with it. If we'd forced ourselves to look at it, would we have fought to end it sooner? And what do we hide behind closed doors today that we might take action on if we could see it in the open?
It's time for our homework question. As always, this is totally optional, but I would love to see your answers in the comments. So, if you were a 17th century monarch ordering the violent execution of your enemies, how would you justify it within the framework of the Anglicanism of the day? How do you argue that this is really what the Lamb of God wants? Bonus points for using specific passages from religious texts as supporting evidence. And remember, it's not just other people you have to convince, it's also yourself. There's so much more I could say about public executions. We didn't even talk about Thomas Blood, who talked his way out of being hanged, drawn and quartered in the 1670s, and we still don't really know what he said to get out of it. So I've written a whole book where we talk about Thomas Blood and 20-odd other people who led strange and unusual lives throughout history. It's called Mavericks, Life Stories and Lessons of History's Most Extraordinary Misfits, and it's out on the 11th of February. You can pre-order the hardback edition all over the world at the link in the description.